Welcome to the Nikon D50 Camera Tutorial DVD. This is the definitive guide for your camera. Our goal is to both instruct and entertain. This DVD is designed by Chapter, so feel free to skip forward or back using your DVD remote if needed. Section 1. Getting started with your camera in full auto mode. Before you can take any pictures, you'll need to mount a lens, charge and insert your battery, and insert a memory card. To mount or install a lens, make sure you hold the camera in one hand, the lens in the other, then line up the white dots on the camera and the lens, insert the lens and turn it gently counterclockwise. Caution, take great care not to scratch the lens by allowing it to make contact with anything. To charge your battery, insert it into the charger like this, then plug the charger into the wall jack. A tip, it takes about 2 hours to fully charge your battery. And your battery will allow you to take about 600 pictures. To insert your charged battery, simply open the battery compartment, then slide in the battery like this. Note, always power off your camera before inserting or replacing your battery or memory card. One more tip about your battery. If you're shooting in cold weather, you'll want to put your battery in your pocket and keep it warm so it'll hold its charge longer. To insert your memory card, open the memory card cover and insert the card like this. A tip, your camera stores pictures on an SD or secure digital memory card. These cards are available in varying sizes from 32 megabytes to 1 gigabyte or more. The larger the card's memory capacity, the more images you'll be able to store before either deleting or copying the images to another device, like your PC's hard drive. It's necessary to format your compact flash card to work with your camera before you can start taking pictures. Caution, don't reformat your card unless you've already copied the images to another device. Reformatting your card will erase all the images. Another tip, your camera will operate faster if you periodically reformat your memory card rather than simply deleting images from it to free space for more picture taking. To format a card, insert a card and then switch the camera on. Press the menu button. Select the menu that looks like a wrench. Select Format, then press the Enter button. Select Yes and press Enter again. To operate your camera, turn the power switch to on and the mode dial to auto. Set the focus mode switch on the camera to AF, and if you have one on the lens, to A. Aim your camera at the subject and make sure at least one of the focus points is over that part of the subject you want in focus. Press the shutter halfway down and hold it until a focus confirmation light shows yellow and you see a focus point flash red. Then press the shutter the rest of the way down to take the picture. Your picture will show on the LCD for about 2 seconds. A tip, in auto mode, the camera automatically selects one of the several focal points for you, the one closest in distance to the camera. You can specify which single focus point the camera will use as follows. Press the points on the multi-selector to select the focus area. All focus areas are indicated with brackets and the active one is solid. The selected focus area is also indicated on the control panel by an icon. This will allow you to select precisely which part of the image you want in focus. It will also make the camera operate just a little bit faster. Practice taking pictures in the auto mode to get a general feel for using the camera. To view a picture image, press the playback button and then the left or right points on the multi-selector button to step through the images stored on your memory card. To delete an image that is being displayed on the LCD, press the delete button. Confirm that you want to delete the image. Practice viewing the picture on your LCD each time you take a picture, and remember, with digital cameras there's no film expense, so take as many pictures as you want and simply delete the images that don't turn out. Section 2, Concepts of Digital Cameras. Now that you know how to use your camera in full auto mode, allow us to discuss some of the basic concepts of digital cameras and photography so you have a foundation to learn how to use your camera in much more powerful and creative ways. To begin, a digital camera is comprised of 4 main parts. First, a lens which magnifies an image, focuses that image, and determines how much or how little light will enter the camera. Second, a shutter assembly, which reflects the image into the viewfinder so you can see it, and which opens when you press the shutter button for a very precise period of time in order to expose the image sensor to the focused image. Third, an image sensor is a silicon chip that, like film in older cameras, is exposed to an image and precisely records that image so it can be converted into a digital file for storage on a memory card. Fourth, a memory card stores images until the images are archived on a PC hard drive or burned to a CD and deleted from the memory card. A tip, it may be convenient to use multiple memory cards. When one card is full, simply insert a new one and continue shooting pictures. Memory cards can be used to store images either permanently or temporarily, although the least expensive way to archive your images is to burn them to a high-quality CD and then store them in a safe, cool, and dry place. To remove your memory card, simply open the memory card compartment and press the memory card in to eject it. A word of caution, handle your memory card with care and never remove it if the access light on the camera is on. You'll want to get into the habit of protecting your great photos on your camera from accidentally being erased. To do this, simply press the play button, then the left or right points on the multi-selector, and when you find the photo you want protected, press the protect button. To exit the playback mode, press the shutter button halfway down. Section 3, Basic Principles of Digital Photography. Digital photography is based on several main concepts. By understanding these well, you'll be able to understand nearly every other photographic concept. Number 1, exposure is the amount of overall lightness or darkness of a photographic image. If the camera has too little light, the exposure will be dark, and it will be hard for you to see the details in the image. If the camera has too much light, the image will be blown out, too white to see detail. Exposure is controlled primarily by two things: A, the lens aperture or opening; B, the duration of the shutter opening or shutter speed. Aperture or opening, measured in f-stops. The smaller the number, the more open the lens and the more light will reach the sensor to make the exposure light. B, the duration of the shutter opening or shutter speed, measured in fractions of a second. The longer the shutter speed, the more light will reach the sensor, and hence the lighter the image. One way to better understand the relationship of aperture and shutter speed on exposure is with an analogy. Consider the proper amount of light or exposure to be like a full bucket of water. Then consider a water tap from which you will fill the bucket to be the aperture or opening on your lens. Finally, consider your camera's shutter speed to be like the amount of time you will leave the water tap turned on. The more the tap is opened, the more water will come through the hose into the bucket, and hence the shorter amount of time you will need the tap to be open. Conversely, if the tap will only open a small amount and water is only trickling into the bucket, you'll need to leave the water turned on for a much longer period of time. An interesting and important note is that shutter speed not only affects exposure, but it also affects clarity during action. A fast shutter speed will freeze a moving subject in your picture, whereas a slow shutter speed will appear to blur a moving object. Fast shutter speeds are therefore useful for taking pictures of sporting events. Slow shutter speeds are useful for taking pictures of waterfalls or car lights at night, giving a very interesting image. Just as important to understand are the secondary effects of aperture. A small aperture not only lets less light reach the image sensor, tending to make a darker exposure, but it also makes the entire scene from near to far appear more sharp or in focus. This optical phenomenon is called a long depth of field. This is useful when photographing a subject in front of a national monument where you want both in focus. A large aperture has the opposite effect. Only the subject of focus will be in focus. This is used extensively in portrait photography as it helps to literally focus attention on the subject. The next most important elements of good photography are angle of view and magnification. Obviously, by moving around or moving your subject around, you can shoot from slightly above, below, and side to side, and closer or farther away to achieve just the right look. Close-ups are great, and you want to include the eyes, well lit. Sometimes a full body shot or shot from even farther back can better help establish your location and situation, which may be what you want. Practice moving your viewing angle to get some really great shots. The lens that you shoot with will also affect the general look of your picture and may be more practical and convenient to use than actually moving closer to or farther away from your subject. A telephoto lens will make things appear closer. This is said to have a long focal length. A common focal length for great portrait photography is about 100 millimeters. A A normal lens is considered to be about what the human eye sees, something between 40 and 50 millimeters. This is said to have a normal focal length. A wide-angle lens will make things appear farther away and will also distort the image in some interesting and fun ways. This is called a short focal length. A zoom lens is very common and can move from one focal length to another by simply moving the dial. A great advantage of a digital SLR is that you can attach different lenses depending on the circumstances. There are dozens of Nikon lenses to choose from. While you can use all of these lenses with your digital SLR, you need to understand that the lenses will be magnified by a factor of 1.6 times compared to your 35mm film SLR. The reason is that the image sensor is smaller than the 35mm film frame, so the sensor sees only the inner portion of what might be seen on 35mm. The result is great for telephoto lens use. Your 200mm telephoto lens will now function as a 320mm lens on your D70 or D70S. The problem is using wide-angle lenses. A 35mm wide-angle lens will show images at 55mm, slightly larger than normal focal length. And an 18mm lens will show images at 28mm, still wide, but not nearly as wide in perspective. So before you go buying a 100mm lens for portrait photography and a 50mm lens for normal picture taking, consider that your lens selection will be multiplied by 1.6 times in appearance with your camera. The final elements of a great photograph are composition and design. The placement of objects and the location within the frame is critical to make a photograph look finished and artistic. While one person's perception of art is different from another's, here are some general principles you'll want to consider. Showcase the main subject. You can make the subject stand out either by lighting, placement, focus, or background-foreground elements. Practice seeing what these different principles can do for your photos. Again, keep in mind that digital cameras have no film operating costs, so take lots of pictures and do a lot of experimenting. Consider your orientation. Do you want a vertical or horizontal image, commonly called portrait versus landscape perspectives? Some subjects just work better as vertical, some as horizontal. It depends on the mood and purpose of your photo. Placing the horizon. The horizon is where the sky meets the land. Typically, a great photo will show the most important subjects in the upper portion of the frame where the eyes naturally want to look. But sometimes the picture works best to divide the picture horizontally by the horizon and showing it higher or lower than center frame depending on the subject matter. Placing your subject or subjects off of center can sometimes create a more pleasing image. The rule of thirds advocates dividing your viewfinder into thirds, both horizontally and vertically, and then placing your most important subjects on one or more of the cross points. You'll notice that the eye lines for close-ups are often aligned with the top line. Remember to lock your focus and exposure to achieve the kind of balanced composition that you want. Before we discuss the last creative manual mode settings, let's take a look at a few additional very useful exposure features of your camera. Even when using one of the digital Vary program modes already discussed, you may find it useful to change the exposure up or down a bit. By using a plus exposure compensation, the subject will get a bit brighter. By using the minus, the subject will get a bit darker. To use the exposure compensation feature of your camera, press the exposure compensation button. Move the main control dial to add or subtract exposure stops. Now press the shutter button the rest of the way to take a picture. Another tip, reset the exposure compensation to 0 when you're done. Otherwise, it will remain in effect even if you've powered your camera off and back on again. A second useful exposure override mode is the exposure focus lock mode. This is useful when you want to point to and specify the part of your image that you want to be properly exposed and in focus, even when you later move your camera slightly to recompose your shot. To use the auto exposure focus lock feature of your camera, press the shutter button halfway down to activate the displays. Aim the camera so as to center in your viewfinder the portion of the image that you want to be properly exposed. Once the focus indicator glows green, press the auto exposure focus lock button. Recompose your picture by zooming out or moving the camera one direction or other. Now press the shutter button the rest of the way to take the picture. Here's a tip. Keep the shutter button pressed halfway down in order to keep that exposure setting. Release the shutter button in order to release the exposure lock. The most manual creative zone setting is manual mode. Use this to set both the aperture and shutter speed setting yourself, and let the camera display an exposure scale, which indicates what your final exposure will be. This is very handy when you want complete control over your camera's exposure. To use this setting, set the mode dial to M. Turn the main control dial to select a shutter speed. Depress and hold the exposure compensation button while turning the main dial to select the desired aperture. You can view the meter through the viewfinder, where a 0 is properly exposed and a -1 or 1 is under or overexposed by 1 stop respectively. Then press the shutter to take the picture. A tip, if the exposure scale indicator is on -1 or 2, your exposure is 1 or 2 stops darker than expected proper exposure. If the exposure scale indicator shows a +1 or 2, your exposure is 1 or 2 stops lighter than expected proper exposure. You cannot use either exposure compensation or auto exposure lock when using the manual mode of your camera. Besides checking your LCD and actually viewing the image after it's taken, another great feature for checking exposure is by viewing the image's histogram graph. A histogram is a graph of all the highlights and shadows of your photo. It represents the range of brightness from shadows on the left to highlights on the right of a horizontal axis. Midtones are shown in the center. On the vertical axis, the magnitude from 0 to 255 of brightness is displayed. The higher the vertical line at any point along the horizontal axis, the greater the number of pixels that the image sensor captured in that range of shadows, midtone, or highlights. A histogram of a photo showing only a lot of pixels in the shadows range on the left side of the graph represents a picture that is mostly dark. And similarly, a histogram of a photo showing only a lot of pixels in the highlights range on the right side of the graph represents a picture that is mostly light. A well-exposed picture is typically one that has a fairly even distribution of pixels across the entire histogram. To see the histogram of an image, press the play button to review photos. Scroll to the photo whose histogram you want to see by pressing the left or right points on the multi-selector button. Then press the up or down points to scroll to the histogram of that image. Press the play or shutter button halfway down to return to normal play or camera mode. To zoom in on an image, press the play button, then press the enter button, Then press and hold the ISO button while turning the main command dial to select an area that will be magnified. Then release the ISO button to see the magnified area. At this point, you can use the multi-selector to view different parts of the photo. Knowing these principles, you can get just the look with the proper exposure you want. But enough photographic theory, let's show you how your camera makes it easy to do these things. On your mode dial, there are basic exposure settings, which are completely automatic, and other, more creative exposure settings, giving you varying levels of control over your exposure. Let's start with the basics, or what Nikon calls the digital vary program modes. You have already used the full auto mode. The next one is the portrait mode. In portrait mode, the camera will set the aperture for wide open, creating a very short depth of field. Then it will adjust the shutter speed as necessary to estimate a proper exposure. This blurs the background as we discussed earlier. Once you set this mode, simply point and click. A tip, these digital vary program modes will only work with CPU lenses. When using type D lenses, make sure you set the aperture to the smallest opening. In the landscape mode, the camera will do the opposite, set the aperture for a very small opening, creating a very long depth of field. Then it will adjust the shutter speed as necessary to achieve a proper exposure. This sharpens the background and foreground. The lens is focused at infinity, giving you a clear picture of faraway objects like mountains and landscapes. Again, point and click to become familiar with this auto exposure mode. A tip, the shutter speed can become quite slow in landscape mode, so be sure to steady your camera to avoid camera shake, which can make everything appear out of focus. The child mode is used when a fast shutter is required to take pictures of those fast-moving children. The aperture is kept smaller in order to keep their clothing and surrounding area in focus as well. The flash will fire if necessary. A tip, when shooting children, try to get down on their level. And remember, you're not paying for film, so take as many pictures as you want and delete the ones you don't like. The sports mode is used when a fast shutter speed is required, which is done automatically by the camera. If you hold the shutter button halfway down in this mode, the camera will continue to recalculate focus, helping you be ready at any moment to depress the shutter and catch the shot quickly. The flash will not fire in this mode. Now you're ready for the really big events in your daughter's life, or your son's. The close-up mode is used to capture flowers and other small objects. Focus is set for the center of the viewfinder. Use this setting with macro lenses or at the lens's minimum focusing distance. The night portrait mode is designed to photograph people in front of a landscape at night. In order for the subject to be well lit, the flash will fire, and in order for the background to be in focus, the aperture is closed a bit, and in order to compensate for it all, the shutter will open for a relatively long period of time. So hold the camera very still or support it with a tripod. Something called the ISO setting of your camera also relates to image exposure. The ISO setting is a way to control the sensitivity of your image sensor chip. You can think of this like ASA ratings of film, 100, 400, and so on. The higher the number, the less light that is required to properly expose the image sensor. To set the ISO, simply press the ISO button. It looks like a square with a cross on it. Then move the main command dial to the setting you want and press the ISO button again. Another tip, keep in mind that the higher the ISO setting, the more noise or digital grain you will introduce into your images. In other words, a high ISO setting can make the image look lousy, full of artifacts or particles. Before we look at the creative manual zone modes, let's look briefly at one more photographic concept: aperture and shutter stop. Both shutter speeds and apertures have a standard series of settings called stops. Opening the aperture by one stop will double the light that reaches the sensor. Similarly, speeding the shutter by one stop will half the light that reaches the sensor. Therefore, by opening the aperture one stop and speeding the shutter by one stop, the exposure is kept constant. By opening the aperture 2 or 3 stops and speeding the shutter 2 or 3 will have the same effect on exposure. It will not change. Thus, the amount of light that reaches the sensor will remain constant. Your pictures will be just as light or dark as they were before. What does change? The depth of field and the subject's motion, frozen or blurred. The first of the more manual creative modes is the Auto Multi-Program mode, indicated with a P on the mode dial. It's like Auto. It will calculate a proper exposure for you. But you can also enable the Flexible Program setting while in this mode. That allows you to easily rotate through and select different aperture shutter speed combinations to emphasize either depth of field or motion in your shot, all while keeping your exposure constant. To operate in this mode, set the power switch to on, set the mode dial to P, turn the main control dial to scroll through the options until you find the one you want, press the shutter all the way down to take the picture. Now here's a tip. When scrolling through options, you'll see the Flexible Program icon displayed. If you have only one option, that's because the exposure settings will not allow others. The next creative manual exposure mode is Shutter Priority, or S, on the mode dial. Use this to set the shutter speed yourself and let the camera calculate the aperture needed to make proper exposure. This is very handy when you know you want to either freeze or blur the motion of your subject. To use this setting, set the mode dial to S, rotate the main command dial to select the desired shutter while looking through the viewfinder to see the shutter speed being displayed. Press the shutter to take the picture. A tip: if the largest aperture, the smallest number, says low, the exposure will be too dark. Select a slower shutter speed. Similarly, if the smallest aperture setting displays the word high, the exposure will be too light. Select a faster shutter speed. Another tip, remember that you can change the ISO setting to make the image sensor less or more sensitive and provide you with a different range of shutter speed options. The next creative manual exposure mode is the aperture priority mode, indicated by the A on the mode dial. Use this to set the aperture setting yourself and let the camera calculate the shutter speed needed to make proper exposure. This is very handy when you know you want to create a long or short depth of field. To use this setting, set the mode dial to A, rotate the main command dial to select the desired shutter while looking through the viewfinder to see the aperture selection, f-stop, being displayed. Press the shutter to take the picture. Again, if the viewfinder displays the words low or high, the exposure will be too dark or too light. Select a different aperture or f-stop to compensate. And once again, remember that you can change the ISO settings to make the image sensor less or more sensitive and provide you with a different range of options. Clearly, proper exposure is a major part of taking good pictures, and by changing the aperture and shutter speed, either with the automatic or manual settings, you can change the depth of field or the motion blur or sharpness while still keeping the exposure you want. The second most important principle of taking great pictures is image sharpness. Image sharpness is affected by several things, including lens focus, depth of field, camera shake, and digital noise. First of all, you may want to have a bit of motion blur in your image for aesthetic effect. In this case, you would experiment with a slower shutter speed. You may also want parts of your image to be sharp and other parts to be out of focus. For this, you would experiment with depth of field changes, as already discussed. This section will talk about how to keep your image sharp when you intend it to be sharp. Let's talk about lens focus. Sometimes the autofocus feature of your camera will have problems, particularly in situations where there is low contrast, highly reflective or bright objects and backgrounds, or overlapping objects at different distances. To ensure that the right part of your subject is in focus, you may want to switch the focus mode selector on the side of your camera to M for manual focusing mode, where you will have full control over focus by simply moving the focus ring left or right. Note, even in manual focus mode, you can press the shutter button halfway down and the focus indicator will glow to indicate that you are in focus. To stay in autofocus mode but gain a bit more control, you may find it helpful to lock your focus on a certain point before recomposing and taking the picture. To do this, with the focus switch on the lens set to AF for autofocus, simply press the shutter halfway down until the focus light and the point appear. Then, still holding the shutter halfway down, move the camera to recompose the picture and then depress the shutter the rest of the way down. Depending on the focus mode that you are using, you may need to press the Auto Exposure Auto Focus Lock button as you did when locking exposure to lock the focus as well. Once the focus is locked, recompose your picture, then press the shutter to take the picture. Another way to get more control while still in autofocus mode is to select a focus point. That is, tell the camera which focus points it should focus on, rather than the default behavior of the camera. To set a focus point with the mode dial on any setting, press the multi-selector button to select the desired AF point. Then depress the shutter to take the picture. Another way to get a clear picture is to increase your depth of field, as we've already discussed, to cover the entire range of what you're trying to get in focus. That way, even if your lens focus is a bit off, you may still have a crystal clear image recorded by the sensor. Another cause of poor focus is camera shake. That is, movement of the camera while the shutter is open, exposing the image sensor. Always steady the camera when you can. Holding the camera with two hands and pressing the viewfinder gently against your face will help. Lean against something if you can, and where possible, use a tripod, monopod, or even a bean bag to rest your camera on. You can also reduce camera shake by selecting a fast shutter speed. This keeps the image sensor from being exposed to shaking conditions more briefly. One general rule of thumb that you may find helpful is the rule of 1 over the focal length. For example, if your lens focal length is 300 millimeters, set your shutter speed to at least 1/300th of a second. If your focal length or zoom is set to 30 millimeters, you may get by with a shutter speed as low as 1/30th of a second or so. Nikon's image stabilizer lenses do a remarkable job of taking out camera shake automatically. Digital grain or noise makes the image appear poor or out of focus. Don't enlarge an image too much, and if you know that you must enlarge an image, select a large file format as possible. To change the image size, hold down the qual button and rotate the sub-command dial to cycle through choices. Select L for large. Saving images in JPEG compression format creates some noise in the image. Also, repeatedly opening and resaving JPEG images in your camera by previewing them repeatedly can degrade the file quality. Save images in RAW format if possible. This is not compressed like JPEG. To select a high-resolution file format, press and hold down the qual button, rotate the main command dial to cycle through the choices, select RAW. Too high of an ISO setting can create noise in your image. Underexposing your photos, too much black, will come across as gray or noisy. Don't underexpose your photos. Another way to keep noise out of your image is to shoot high-contrast subjects. Gradual gradations, like the sky's changing blue colors, cause grain-like patterns in the image. Finally, to help keep noise out of your images, allow your camera to cool off before shooting more pictures. An overheated image sensor will add noise to your image. Your camera is capable of storing images in two file types, RAW or uncompressed NEF files, and JPEG, which is compressed and smaller. The RAW file keeps more of the image data and is therefore a better quality image file. It can be edited with popular software packages like Adobe Photoshop. If you have plenty of memory space available, or if you plan to manipulate your photos in Photoshop, you'll want to shoot photos in RAW format. Save images in RAW format if possible. This is not compressed like JPEG. JPEG is a compressed file format. It retains an amazing amount of quality and can be edited with photo manipulation software also. Use this format if you have less space or don't need to do a lot of touching up of your photos. Saving images in JPEG compression format creates some noise in the image. Also, repeatedly opening and resaving JPEG images in your camera by previewing them repeatedly can degrade the file quality. The number of photos available with a 512 megabyte memory in the RAW format is 50. In JPEG, it's 170. A third major ingredient of a good photo is to carefully choose the color of your surrounding light and tell your camera what color that light is. First, a bit about the color of light. While all light looks white to an untrained eye, each type of light, sunlight at daytime, sunlight in the shade or under cloudy conditions, light coming from a tungsten lamp or fluorescent fixture, are all composed of different colors. Daylight is more blue. If your camera thinks that you're photographing in daylight, but you are photographing in a setting that uses tungsten light, your image will look overly red. While all light looks white to an untrained eye, setting your white balance, or telling your camera what the color of white light is, will help your pictures have a proper coloring. Your camera will attempt to automatically determine the white balance, but you'll get better results if you set a preset white balance or by manually customizing your white balance, which will provide the very best results. Here is how you select a preset white balance. With the mode dial set to P, S, A, or M mode, hold down the WB button and rotate the main command dial until you've displayed the white balance icon that you want to select. Your flash will usually be a bit blue in color, more so than daylight, so set your white balance mode to flash when using the flash for great frontal lighting that is also compatible with the background's lighting and color temperatures. Here is how you set a custom white balance. With the mode dial set to P, S, A, or M mode, focus manually on a white sheet of paper that fills at least the center 9% of your viewfinder. Then press the shutter button, then press the menu button, and select the camera menu. Scroll to the white balance option, press the enter button, select preset, press enter, select use photo, then select the picture that you just took, then press enter. Then press the white balance button, then turn the main dial to scroll through and highlight the custom settings displayed on the LCD. Press the shutter button or menu button to exit. A tip, this white balance setting will remain in effect during all Creative Zone settings until you change it. Another tip, if you shoot in raw file mode as previously discussed, you can modify the white balance later by using the software that came with your camera or by using Adobe Photoshop. You can measure light by using your camera's light meter in manual mode. This will weigh most heavily the center portion of your image. By using a long focal length lens or zoom lens in telephoto position and measuring the light on each part of your photo frame or subject, you can get a sense for how bright or dark the various areas are. If an area is too bright, it will be clipped by the image sensor and appear completely white. If an area is too dark, it will appear grayish and full of noise. When light shines directly onto your subject from a bright lamp or other source, it can create stark contrast and pronounced shadows. Usually, it's more flattering to your subject to shoot under cloud cover, in the shade, or with reflected or diffused light, such as when light reflects off an umbrella or shines through silk. The direction of the light will impact the end result. Study and experiment with placing your subject or bouncing or reflecting light so as to achieve the look that you're after. By shining a bit more light on one side of an object than another, you can create an illusion of three-dimension, which is important for good two-dimensional images. The greater the contrast between the light and dark portions, the more dramatic your photo will be. As discussed previously, a great photo will show a full range of light from highlight to shadows as shown in the histogram of that image. Direct your subjects and light your scene if possible until you can achieve a great balance of highlights, midtones, and shadows in your picture. Use backlight to create silhouettes when desirable. Use either exposure compensation in any creative mode to achieve this. You can review those sections at any time by pressing the Skip Chapter Backwards button on your DVD remote. Simplify your picture and background. A great photo is often simple. It requires patience to get just the right shot sometimes. To direct the viewer's eyes and to make a picture interesting to look at, notice the lines, shapes, and textures of your subject and apply composition principles in a way that will accentuate these things. Sometimes a great picture is waiting for you in the patterns and repetitions of daily life that are often unobserved. By showing the scale of subjects in frame, you can make a photo more informative and even awe-inspiring. And finally, use foreground objects as natural frames to enclose and give contrast to your primary subject. We hope you've learned a lot and had some fun while learning. Please look for our advanced tutorial DVD, which will show you many more tips and tricks for taking great photos of people and nature. It will also discuss digital workflow issues, how to manipulate your photo images using Adobe Photoshop, and ways to archive your photos, such as burning them to CD. You will also learn to enjoy and share your photos in new ways by creating video photo montage DVDs.